Our next chapter is chapter 28, 1968 to 1980. We will cover Presidents Nixon, Presidents Ford, and Presidents Carter. Richard Nixon won the election of 1968. He used what he called a Southern strategy. He decided to slowly desegregate, and unfortunately, a lot of Southerners agreed with this. He named a Southerner to the Supreme Court, and he stopped busing to desegregate schools. Nixon vowed to uphold law and order. He was 100% against any Vietnam War protests and things like that. His ideas for changing our country were called New Federalism. He wanted to reduce the size of the government. He wanted to give more, he wanted to give the state, and local governments more control. He did not want to continue to fund the Department of Housing and Urban Development for low-income housing. He wanted to eliminate the Office of Economic Opportunity, which helped minorities. However, he did want to reform welfare to make it a little bit better. Here is a picture of Richard Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger. Nixon's foreign policy, he's like, the old adage, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Well, he decided he was going to visit our two biggest enemies, China and Soviet Union, because both governments were communist. And of course, America was against communism because communism means no individual freedom. So meeting with the leader of China, Mao Zedong, and meeting with the leader of Russia, Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, Nixon was very successful in having a relationship with both countries. Here is a picture of Nixon at the top with the Chinese leader and at the bottom with the Soviet leader. Nixon, unfortunately, was paranoid. He thought everybody was out to get him. He told his advisors, do whatever you need to do to make sure I win re-election in 1972. His Democratic challenger was Senator George McGovern. However, Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman in Congress, also ran to try to beat Nixon, but she was unsuccessful. Nixon's advisors ordered 5 men to break into the Watergate building in Washington, D.C., where McGovern had his National Democratic Party headquarters. They were told to steal anything important, bug and wiretap phones. Unfortunately, the men were caught and arrested, and Nixon tried to help cover up the crime, which is illegal. Here's a picture of the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. So Nixon's advisors tried to cover it up, but Nixon was reelected during this time. However, Nixon taped all phone conversations in the White House, which turned out to be a big mistake because he was on tape trying to cover up the crime. He tried to use executive privilege not to hand over the tapes, but the special prosecutor in the case said, no, you have to hand them over. Eventually, the Supreme Court forced him to hand them over. In the meantime, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign because he had found out he was taking bribes. So Gerald Ford was appointed as Nixon's next vice president and approved by the Senate. Nixon was impeached, brought up on charges of trying to cover up a crime. Here is a picture of the old vice president, Spiro Agnew, and the new Gerald Ford. Congress ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. Finally, the tapes were turned over, but Nixon had erased a 30-minute section, which of course made him look very guilty. Knowing he probably would have been impeached and maybe forced to leave office, he resigned on August 9th of 1974. He's the first president to have ever resigned from office. The new president, which was the vice president, Gerald Ford, pardoned Nixon of all crimes. A president can pardon anyone of a crime, and they cannot be tried again. Here is a political cartoon showing the part of the tape that was erased. Our next presidents are Ford and Carter. In the mid-1960s and early 1970s, we had a lot of inflation, which is high prices, and an oil crisis, and a trade ban or embargo. Gas prices went up. In addition, a lot of U.S. plants had old equipment that dated back to the World War II. Stagflation starts because people not only are upset about high prices, but they are also losing their jobs. And so high unemployment and high inflation was plaguing the nation. Nixon tried to fight inflation first. It was unsuccessful. Ford tried to fight inflation first. It was unsuccessful. President Ford did try to stop the spread of communism by going to Helsinki and signing the Helsinki Accord agreement. However, while President Ford was president, the Cambodians, which is near Vietnam, sunk the Mayaguez U.S. cargo ship. We sent Marines to go back and get the crew and ship, but 41 soldiers died in the battle. In 1976, people wanted a new change in government, so they elected Jimmy Carter, who was a former governor of Georgia, a peanut farmer, and a Navy officer. Carter was going to increase government spending and cut taxes to reduce unemployment, but then inflation rose. He tried deregulation, which is less government control of business. He tried to raise interest rates and reduce the money supply and lower prices. Most of these were unsuccessful. Here's a picture of Jimmy Carter. Carter proposed conserving energy, reducing the use of oil, and promoting coal and solar, which we use a lot today. Carter agreed to give up the Panama Canal back to Panama in 1999, and Carter called the Soviet Union on their human rights. Unfortunately, he was so against communism and the Soviet Union that he would not allow our Olympic athletes to go to the Olympics in Moscow, Russia. They were boycotted, and the American athletes were not allowed to go. In 1978, Carter hosted the Camp David Accords, which is a meeting between the leaders of Israel and Egypt. He helped the Shah, Reza Pahlavi of Iran, allowing him medical treatment, even though the people of Iran hated him. So the new leader of Iran, a Muslim leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, when he takes power, he storms the American embassy, and they take 52 Americans hostage. And during Carter's term, he tried to get the hostages freed. Unfortunately, they were not, and it wasn't until Ronald Reagan becomes our next president, after 444 days in captivity, that the hostages are released. Here's some pictures from that time. Civil rights at this time was still a big issue. Affirmative action, companies and schools recruiting African Americans, became very important. Using race as only one criteria for admission could be used. However, some people didn't like this. For example, the University of California Regents denied Bakke admission to their school. He said reverse discrimination, argued he did not get in because he was white. In 1971, Shirley Chisholm becomes the first African-American woman to Congress. In 1977, Andrew Young becomes the first African-American U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. In 1988, African-American and Congressman Jesse Jackson runs for president. He's unsuccessful. And in 1990, the first black governor of a state is L. Douglas Wilder from Virginia. Native Americans at this time had a lot of problems and a lot of issues. They were still upset because their land was taken and they were forced to move to reservations. The Crazy Horse Monument is being carved at this time to represent in South Dakota's Black Hills the Native American history there. The Disabilities Act has been passed and has since been changed a lot. And basically what it says is that anyone that's handicapped has a right to an education. They also have a right to get into public buildings. And so there are all kinds of things now today that allow people with physical disabilities to get around. For example, these tactile mats, I guess you'd call them, help people that are blind tell how far it is from one corner to another. Here's another picture that you might see in town, the red mats there. And so this chapter really is about trying to make things better. For example, trying to make the environment more clean, more safe, having our first Earth Day in April of 1970, trying to make sure our air is cleaner, and trying to make sure that nuclear power issues and creating electricity using more safe and more clean ways is really achieved. Here's a picture of a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania that almost had a catastrophe. So the late 1960s and 1970s was a time of high unemployment, high prices, pollution, trying to make changes, trying to bring more equality. So it was a very trying time for Americans.